Hi, I want to make a video on spreading the message, philosophy, and whatever philosophy it may be. Insert any kind of philosophy, spreading any kind of message, especially considering from my point of view or any kind of point of view when you're discussing a philosophy such as discussing evolution, the facts of existence, any philosophy that has to do with any kind of extinction, antinatalism, any kind of futility of life, the life game that we're playing, the maze game, the zero-sum game, any kind of spreading any kind of message. I've made similar videos like this, and I want to just go over the subject again more precisely, more and tackle a more specific subject when it comes to convincing people and how you're supposed to convince them and what to convince them of and how to get the most people the most efficiently over to the right side as possible. And the best way to do that, obviously, I would say is to in a way, I would say to emotionally get to them, but also spread the message intellectually. Because obviously, if you spread the message emotionally, say if a person was growing up as a child, growing up into an adult, and you kept spreading the message or sending the message emotionally, and you kept saying things and um, almost in a way abusing the kid. Obviously, it was an outright abuse immediately once, say, you had the child. But then again, you had the child, now you're going to tell them um, even though you were one of the abusers, you're going to tell them by abusing them once they exist, by allowing them to exist to begin with, then abusing them after they exist. Regardless of that, using that as an example, you abuse them emotionally once you push the message in, say, too much emotionally. You say you're a piece of shit. Obviously, we're playing a game of parasitism, and where we're constantly parasiting off of everyone. That's obviously not a good thing, and how it's very futile and pointless because all we're doing is fighting the negatives that we experience in our existence. That seems kind of useless. It's not a philosophy to spread to someone, especially when you were one of the ones responsible for, violating the philosophy you say believe in and spreading to the child, and then, violating it and then telling them not to do it yourself, and then, being a perpetrator yourself. Obviously, it's better to send the message to prevent, say, further mistakes from happening, but you're still a perpetrator and a hypocrite. But at least you're sending a message, and it's better than sending no message at all. To at least make sure that it doesn't happen again, the same mistake doesn't happen over and over again, because the cycle can become redundant and it can happen endlessly if you don't find a way to stop. If you don't become the one to at least spread the message, or you don't become the one responsible for not making the same mistake that the other people make. So take a little responsibility. In many cases, that's all it takes. It doesn't necessarily take an emotional or even an intellectual understanding. It takes sometimes all it takes is irrelevant excuses. In many cases, they say, "I don't want to have a child," but then you have they don't mind anyone else having a child, but they don't want to have the responsibility for having a child. That's their excuse, and sometimes it takes place of the emotional or intellectual understanding. I would say, or emotional reaction, negative emotional reaction, or intellectual understanding of, say, something such as understanding that that might not be the best thing, or emotionally reacting negatively. Obviously, emotionally, in many ways, you would react because you say you don't want the responsibility, and that's more of an emotional reaction and an intellectual reaction. If I want to make the distinctions, it takes a little on both, but I guess you can say it's more on one side or the other when it comes to certain decisions and why you're making these decisions. For whatever philosophy you're using, antinatalism is the best example to use, because that's the ultimate goal. Because it doesn't matter about the philosophy, it's about convincing people at this point, because the philosophy is already obvious. The convincing point is what we're trying to do, convince people not to have any more children, because the game has already been figured out. And it's not that it's already been figured out that's the only problem, it's that there's nothing to this game as well. Figuring out the game and figuring out there's nothing to this game, and figuring out the game is something we've already mostly done. There's nothing really more that has to do with the fundamental aspects of existence that we're here to figure out. Therefore, what's the point in figuring anything else out? There's no mystery left in the universe. There never really was. The facts are right in front of us. It's just a matter of explaining them and having a mutual understanding between one thinking sentient and then another thinking person, and that's the ultimate goal. So the ultimate goal, using antinatalism as an example, is to just make sure this message is spread. Whatever excuses, as long as you can convince them, is the best way. But obviously, it's best to use the most efficient excuse or most efficient means to reach an end when it comes to a certain idea. Because, like I mentioned before, it's not about figuring out life or figuring out the meaning of life. It's not knowing the meaning of life. It's not knowing whatever meaning you want to apply to life. The meaning of life, in many cases, is your delusion. It's your projections of value. The meaning of life is the value that you have by being a sentient being, by experiencing positive and negative sensations, or in place of positive, less negative and more negative experiences in your existence, because it's a zero-sum game. You need our addictions. We need the satisfaction. It's about satisfying our tensions. You need to have the want before you can have the need, and the need to satisfy, and the satisfaction you get from that want and need. So the desire comes first before the satisfaction. The satisfaction is only there because you have a desire to begin with, and that desire is a tension that builds up in you before you're satisfied. Even like I mentioned before, something like sexual tension is something that you experience because it's something that you have as a tension, and even if you think it's something nice, even the thing that's least obvious to less obvious to be something that would be an addiction is or something that seems like it's not as painful as something like sex or hunger. You feel good, but then you realize being hungry is fun because you can eat, but it's the satisfaction that you're anticipating. The feeling of eating once you're ready to eat is the anticipation. It's a psychological projection, a fooling mechanism in a way to make you feel like the attention isn't really attention, and it's something that's really a positive. And it's not really a positive, it's an illusion. Sort of like the illusion of life. It doesn't really matter, it's synonymous, and it's just a matter of looking at it a certain way. You're looking at life a certain way. Okay, the life's an illusion, illusion's life. It's synonymous with one another, sort of like it's synonymous. You see exactly what it is. It seems like a positive, but you realize it's all perceptual and projectional. And all it is, yes, you can see it that way, but it's synonymous with the fact that it's just a negative zero-sum game where you're fighting the negatives that you're experiencing on a day-to-day basis, going through life before you finally die. Life is death. It's a dying process. And that's what you're doing once you begin. You're ready to die. The possibility of being a harm is right there. That's all. You're a harm. A person, you're a harmable. That's able to be harmed once you exist. And once you exist, that's the only thing you're going to be fighting is a harm and fixing that harm. And since that's the only thing you're going to be fighting, it's proof enough that it's the thing that you're really, that's the main point, is to fight the harm that you're experiencing. You're harmable, and the only thing potential is to harm and to take away that harm once you experience it. Sort of like any kind of deprivation, you're fighting the deprivation. And the harm, it's either, okay, you're taking away the harm, you're preventing harm, or you're taking away the harm that you already had, like I mentioned before, taking or preventing harm. And it's best to prevent the harm after you may have learned a lesson by taking the harm, but it's best to take as little harm and prevent as much harm as possible, to be as efficient as possible. Or if you're talking about some kind of other deprivation, like some kind of tension, that's still a harm. It's still a buildup of want and desire, which is a tension that builds up over time, which becomes, in the end, even like something like I mentioned, sexual desire or hunger, it becomes a detriment, it becomes obnoxious, becomes a negative feeling. So that's something that we're obviously fighting. And then going back to the idea when I was mentioning, it's not about the existence of knowing the answers to life. It's about convincing people of the message. Let them know just enough about it for them to be convinced and realize, regardless of the fact that it may seem like you're manipulating. It's the manipulation for the right reason. Recognizing the basic fundamental aspects of existence, zero-sum game, parasitism, that we're parasites. It's a deterministic mechanism. Knowing those three things, determinism, parasitism, and the fact that we're a zero-sum game, are proof enough to prove the futility. Sort of like you don't understand necessarily why life may be futile. You can't really put your finger on it. But you realize it's those three things. You think something's going to happen anyway. There's nothing we can do because we're parasites. We're constantly eating off each other, which has to do with the idea of something like, obviously we're reproducing, which is causing the parasitism, or we're cannibalizing other people, and it becomes synonymous, this parasitism and determinism, because it's part of the mechanism where we all are byproducts of each other. So the parasitism is sort of like taking away from someone else, and the fact that it's deterministic proves that we can't do anything but interact with the environment. We're byproducts of the environment, so both of them are just byproducts. And the fact that it's a zero-sum game anyway, so we're constantly enforcing our own rules on ourselves and other people around us based on our actions, but our actions are based on everyone else, so it's synonymous with the interaction that we experience from everyone else. Life is synonymous with a deterministic mechanism, cause and effect interaction, which is beyond our control to many degrees, but the control is still here in the mechanism itself. It's still an awareness inside the mechanism, which has the illusion of awareness, even though not the illusion of awareness, but delusion of control, even though the control is not there, and it's completely a manipulation of perception and projection and illusion in the end. So yeah, it doesn't matter about the answers we may have or whatever, figure out the life a game. As long as you have the fundamental mechanism, any other answer doesn't really mean anything, because you know the game you're playing, generally speaking. Knowing everything doesn't mean anything. Knowing how where every atom's moving, where every single individual thing is moving doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any meaning, really. It's just knowing the fundamental mechanism, the difference between knowing the function and knowing how everything is moving. It's about knowing the function, knowing the proper definition, not the proper definition in every context. You don't need to know the proper definition in every context. You just need to know the function, the basic definition, and apply it depending on the circumstance. Sort of like a definition, it's about function more than every single, about and then exactly the specific circumstances. And that's what people often use as an excuse that we don't know everything because we don't know every single circumstance. Well, we know the function, and the function is what matters. Deterministic mechanism, evolution, the facts of reality, determinism, interaction, parasitism. We reproduce, and that's a parasitic mechanism of forcing against someone's consent. And then also the fact that it's a zero-sum game. Realizing these things, cause and effect, all these things, form into one idea, coming at it from different angles, that you realize all these things are facts of reality. And once you realize even just half of them, even just realizing it's a zero-sum game is proof enough that the life game isn't really worth living in the end. So it's one of those games where you realize with just one simple fact that it's not worth it. Like I mentioned before, going back to the same point I keep going to, it's not about realizing the answers to life or the life game. It's about because the answers don't matter. It's the function. We know the function of the game that we're playing. Once you spread the message just enough, it's not about knowing the answers. It's about convincing people. It's about convincing, spreading the message. If it needs some philosophy and recognition, like saying it's a zero-sum game and going through some examples, sometimes it's necessary. But the answers don't mean anything. All the answers, whatever answer, it's knowing the basic function and understanding the basic philosophy. It's very simple, letting all the other crap out of the way. It's about understanding the basic philosophy, looking through all the crap, looking through, taking a step back and look at exactly what you're looking at, as opposed to looking at a close-up, blurred version, and not knowing exactly what you're looking at. And that's obviously the most useful way of viewing it, because it's a very basic philosophy. It's usually crap getting in the way, such as religion. It's an addition to the facts of reality, as opposed to being diluted. And it's easy. We're obviously here to be diluted and then to die. We're here to be deluded and then to die. We're here to be convinced of all sorts of things, true or false, live with those things, have those things have an effect on us and everyone else, and then regardless of that, we end up having to experience the death in the end, regardless. And it's obviously going through the death with ease, or not, or going through life with ease, or going through the sentient experience with ease, as opposed to going through a great amount of negative experience or suffering, or whatever it may be. But yes, it's about convincing people of the message, because all the questions that we have to ask are irrelevant and they're already answered. And if you have more questions, and they're just contrived questions that aren't meant to be answered, they're just questions about every single circumstance of existence, and creating all sorts of paradoxes, conundrums, and pointless irrelevancies that have nothing to do with any kind of real thing that means anything, because you realize it doesn't go anywhere. So like I mentioned, you don't realize why you exactly realize the meaninglessness of life. You just realize all these things that you connect together, and you look at it from a different point of view, and you realize, oh, that's why it's meaningless. I can put my finger on it right now, but I can't change the fact that it's meaningless. It's still meaningless. I can put my finger on why it's meaningless, but I can't change the fact that it's meaningless, other than the fact that there's value and that we're experiencing the value. So like I mentioned, yeah, it doesn't matter. It's about convincing people at this point. And the convincing is what matters, because any facts of reality are irrelevant to the fact that we're obviously realize the function. The function is, like I mentioned, those things: parasitism, interaction, determinism, consumption, reproduction, cannibalism, addiction, parasitism. To quote someone, obviously, and Mendham. But obviously those are many of the basic fundamental aspects of existence, and also determinism, interaction, all those things. The fundamental aspects of existence, philosophy, and things that are factually true, that physically existed as a function more than anything, rather than saying how an ape may have evolved, just realizing using a function such as evolution to realize how exactly things have functioned. So that's obviously the most important thing, so is realizing the function more than every single circumstance, and how that function applies to every single circumstance. It's nice to use a few examples, but it's just knowing about the basic function more than anything. So yes, anyway, it's about convincing people. Like I mentioned, it's not about anything else. Convincing people, and it's about knowing the basic facts, convincing people more than convincing them of any, instead of just spewing the facts or whatever it may be. It's about convincing them, not giving them the details, even though those are part of it. knowing the details and finding the meaning of life by knowing some kind of mystery or relevant to knowing the function. But the function is convincing, and it takes sometimes those facts to convince a person of these truths of existence and convince a person philosophically and bring them over from one side to another. And in many cases, whatever facts or mystery that lay beyond that function of getting that argument to another person, having them understand it, are kind of irrelevant. So any kind of meaning behind the philosophy doesn't mean anything. It's about spreading the idea and having the philosophy take action. The idea beyond that doesn't mean anything other than create an action. And once the action's gone so far, the action becomes irrelevant, especially the idea. If the idea becomes irrelevant, then if the action becomes irrelevant, obviously the idea has become irrelevant. So once one of those things, once the idea is irrelevant, the action is irrelevant, the idea is obviously irrelevant. It became irrelevant before because the action is the thing that the idea was trying to cause. At least some kind of action, because without the action, the idea would mean nothing. So once the action's taken place, the idea obviously is irrelevant by recognitions of reality. It's irrelevant by automatically. And it was more often than not before the action took place and became irrelevant once the action already met its end. It created an end, and now whatever it created was finished. Therefore, it's an irrelevant thing of the past now. What it created prevented all sorts of suffering, and preventing suffering is the only real thing, but obviously it didn't create any value. It just took away the possibility for a negative value, which is the only value that we experience. So there's no real positive value. So that's the thing that we're fighting and trying to convince people of. It's not about knowing what's behind curtain number 10, then 20, then 30, then a goopaplex. It's not about realizing those questions, because those questions are irrelevant once you realize the basic function. And that's the main point, because you can only go behind curtain number 10, and after that, it's not about continually finding what's behind the extra curtains. It's just to realize, okay, I understand the function here now. Let's convince people, and that's the only reasonable thing to do at this point, is to convince people of the function and realize that and whatever extra additions there might be to the function are completely and utterly irrelevant, meaningless, and pointless. And then obviously that we have value by experiencing our sentience. And that's another fundamental basic concept and aspect of the existence that I'm obviously speaking about. So emotionally, getting to people emotionally obviously is important, and emotional and intellectual, like I was mentioning before, there's a balance there. But obviously it's best to intellectually get to someone, let them intellectually understand there, rather than say suffering and the consequences of emotionally being damaged by these things. But emotional things are obviously going to come from an intellectual understanding, but to a lesser extent. In many cases, like me, it was more of a psychological, subconscious thing that happened to me first when I was that I started recognizing these things. It was a long, gradual thing over many years that I started. It was an irrelevant thing that didn't mean much to me, to becoming something that really meant something to me, and it controlled every aspect of my existence over the past over a dozen years, where it gradually kept getting more and more strong. So it was more of a subconscious recognition of experiencing some kind of anxiety, something, not the anxiety of it, the negative experience of anxiety, but the recognition I had from that anxiety, whatever it may have been. So it's one of those things that happens over the course of over a dozen years, maybe over the course of my entire lifetime, that gradually made it more and more intense and more recognized, and more I grew, and more I started recognizing intellectually as well. But the intellectual, I'd say, came after the emotional scarring or damage of experiencing something like that. But that's regardless of that. I guess along the same extent, it's less likely to become emotional if it's something you intellectually understand first, because you won't let the emotional get to you. But the emotional, breeds an intellectual understanding more often than not. So if you want a more thorough feeling of the nature of existence, I suppose, emotionally lock yourself into a closet. Otherwise, it's best to convince people intellectually, as opposed to spewing it, thrusting it down someone's throat, and emotionally, to say, damaging them. It's better to intellectually understand and say not cause them much suffering, but have the passion at the same time, along with the intellectual understanding, to have some emotion when it comes to, say, something like empathy or whatever it may be, and ethics, and understanding that stuff, and have passion for it, but not necessarily have a severe negative personal impact on your own life emotionally, because of those things that you think or maybe end up being good things, because it's preventing more harm or whatever it may be. So it's best to emotionally, intellectually get to a person more than I say emotionally. But if you have to get to a person emotionally, obviously that's how many people are convinced of arguments, but not thoroughly, but to at least get the point across. Emotionally appeal to them intellectually. So emotionally appeal to them, but use an intellectual argument after you've opened the gates to allow that argument to at least exist mutually between you and the person you're trying to convince, say, of an argument. So it's one of those important things that needs to be considered, those distinctions. So yeah, this video went on very long, longer than I intended, but that's the basic idea. Emotional versus intellectual understanding and different aspects of reality, how to convince people and why you should convince people, and obviously the different distinctions and aspects of existence that we're experiencing. So I apologize if I was talking too fast again, but I just wanted to make sure because this video was going on long, way too long anyway, nearly 21 minutes. But anyway, yeah, I went over the basic idea, emotional versus intellectual. You know, the damage that comes with intellectual, say raising a child, you know, as opposed to yourself as well. And intellectual understandings as well are important. But that's the best way to convince them, if that's by which the only means that you need it, and have some passion along with that, say from a personal experience, but not the personal experience of saying experience, recognizing the negatives based on recognizing the truth of reality, whatever may say emotional damage that may cause, and just having that person have such a damaged ego and damaged psychology because of that recognition, that blank slate recognition, where it's blank slate because you didn't insert any kind of delusions in their brain and their neurology. And it's best to convince them by not allowing those things. It's about preventing all those things, like preventing suffering, the zero-sum game, preventing all that crap from getting in their neurology and their brain and their mind. And it's about keeping that stuff out, and almost in a way overtly emotionally abusing that idea and pushing it into them, not only avoiding, say, something like a religion, but pushing the ideas into someone's face more than anything else. But I'm obviously emotionally getting to them and forcing them, and almost in a more subdued way, intellectually push it on them after you've emotionally opened the floodgates of a person's mind to allow recognition of reality more than anything, and not allow denial and things like that get in the way, especially once a person's allowed you to know that they're catching on. It's about a mutual understanding in the end, really. So before I go on into a line, you get the basic idea. So the basic idea, emotional versus intellectual, and I think you can understand those basic ideas. It's better to at least have emotional, intellectual. If you need emotional, I suppose that's something that's an added extra that you may need in certain circumstances, depending on the circumstance. But obviously, it doesn't necessarily mean the circumstance. It's generally better, like circumstance I mentioned. It doesn't matter about the specific circumstance. You can say, generally speaking, it's not good to push grannies in the middle of roads. It's better to do something else, let's say like help them cross, or it's not like it's better to intellectually convince someone as opposed to emotionally abusing the ideas in their brains, or, you know, obviously, generally speaking. I'm not going to go into detail and correct myself over and over again, but that's the basic idea. So yes. Anyway, that's all I need to say. Sorry for the long video. I hope it was interesting enough. I know I'm monotone right now, but I'm kind of tired. But anyway, that's the basic idea, and I guess that's all I want to mention. So if I have anything else to mention on the subject, I'll mention it in another video. So thank you, and until next time. And I'll make sure things change a little bit from here on out. We'll see what happens. So thank you, and until next time. Bye.